Hello and welcome everyone. Today's session begins a new unit, sort of. Well, it's really rather an extension of where we left off with the last one, which was the Enlightenment and classical liberalism, if you remember correctly. In this unit, we're going to examine how the ideas of the Enlightenment applied to or even spawned a series of wars and revolutions between the mid 1600s and about 1800. The first of these, which we'll cover today, is the English Civil War. So let's take a look at the essential questions. Now, as far as the essential questions go, we've obviously got the stuff about the English Civil War, which clearly is very important. That's what we're talking about today. But one essential question in particular, down at the very bottom, is going to be most important to us. We'll get to that in just a second. So, English Civil War. It all starts with the beginning of a new dynasty in England, the Stuart dynasty. So who becomes the new monarch after Queen Elizabeth's death? And why does this monarch very often clash with Parliament? How is this really the beginning of a lot of problems for England? Then we get into the Civil War itself. Why does the English Civil War begin? What two sides are fighting each other? What's the outcome of the war? In the aftermath of the war, how does England end up in a position that is really not that different from where they started before the war? So we'll look at all those things. But most importantly, something I want us to look at with this revolution, war, and the other revolutions we're going to cover in this unit is how well does the event align to the philosophies of the Enlightenment. Now, granted, the English Civil War kind of predates the Enlightenment, but they're very close, and it's worth taking a look at it. And with the other revolutions and wars that we'll examine, we want to see how well do they align to those Enlightenment classical liberalistic ideas, especially the ones that are spawned by the Enlightenment, happened during the Enlightenment. They may start with these lofty classical liberal goals, but do they end up that way? How well do they stick to those goals? And that's something that we'll talk about in class, and it's something that I want you to be thinking about as we examine each of these wars and revolutions. So how well does this event align to the philosophies of the Enlightenment? Be thinking about that as we're going through it, all right? So these are the essential questions. Thus, without further ado, let's go ahead and begin. All right, so as I said, England's problems really begin with an ending. Okay, when Queen Elizabeth dies with no children, we run into a real succession problem because she has no direct heirs. So what happens then is the throne passes to this guy, James, the King of Scotland. He's the son of Queen Elizabeth's cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. And so the end of the Tudor dynasty spawns the beginning of the Stuart dynasty in England. Now, King James, as I said, he comes from Scotland, and he's a firm believer in absolute monarchy and the concept of divine right of kings. And he's used to, ruling in an absolute monarchy. He's used to dealing with Scotland's very weak, wishy-washy parliament, where he gets what he wants because he can rule basically as an absolute monarch. But Scotland is not England. England is not an absolute monarchy. They don't believe in divine right. England is a limited monarchy where they have a very strong parliament. And yet James thinks, this is the way I do things in Scotland. I'm going to come down to England and be able to do things the same way. That's a big mistake, because at the same time that he wants to rule as an absolute monarch in England, you've got England's parliament, who is looking to increase their own role in England's political life. They had been, ruled by Queen Elizabeth for decades, and she was a very popular queen, and oftentimes Parliament simply gave her whatever she wanted. But now that she's gone, Parliament really wants to put its foot down and put its own stamp on the English political landscapes. They're looking to increase their power as James is looking to rule with more power of his own. And so as a result, the two of them regularly struggled for power. It's a power struggle between the two of them. It's about what you would expect. And generally the power struggle revolved around taxes and religion. It's the areas where both of them could sort of exert their control over the other. James wanted Parliament to approve his taxes, but going all the way back to the Magna Carta, Parliament had to approve those things, while at the same time, a growing number of Puritans in Parliament, that's these guys here, they wanted James to remove all the remaining Catholic rituals from the Anglican Church. And that's kind of who Puritans are. That's kind of where their name comes from. The Puritans are very, very strict, extremely religious Protestants. Think of them like the Anabaptists that we talked about from the Protestant Reformation. Anabaptists on steroids almost. They're called Puritans because they wanted to purify the English church of all its remaining Catholic rituals. They're very, very strict, very, very extreme in their religious beliefs. And so Parliament is making up of a growing number of these individuals. And so Parliament would kind of exercise their authority over James by constantly either refusing to approve of his taxes, or if he'd ask for money, they would approve of only a fraction of the amount that he actually wanted, sort of to, wave it in his face that they could do that to him. And on the flip side, James would constantly reject the Puritans' calls for religious cleansing within the English church. And so back and forth it goes, on and on and on, during all the years of James's reign. And after James dies, his son Charles becomes the new king, King Charles I. And like his father, Charles believed in divine right and absolute monarchy, and thus he inherited the same problems that plagued his daddy. And the struggles would continue between Parliament and the monarchy under Charles. They would continue, that is, until Charles simply dissolved Parliament and vowed to never call it back into session. They went back and forth all the time, and eventually he said, "I'm done with you." That's one of the powers that the king has, is to call Parliament into session and get rid of Parliament. And so he said, I'm done. He dissolved Parliament, and he vowed he would never call them back into session. And he didn't for 11 years. And so, of course, this whole thing outrages the English people, and the situation became even worse when Charles, without Parliament to limit him, began ruling as if he were an absolute monarch, imprisoning his opponents, people who disagreed with him, confiscating people's wealth, punishing his opponents without a trial. I mean, these are all things that are, okay, not as bad as the emperor there, but they're definitely the acts of a tyrant, and this is not something that the English people care to tolerate because they have lived under limited monarchs for so long. And now you're getting this person who wants to come in and act as an absolutist. It's not sitting too well with too many people. And so for 11 years, he was able to pull this off because he simply said, "I'm going to rule without Parliament." But eventually Charles was forced to recall Parliament because he was in desperate need of money, had exhausted all other avenues, and England was now facing an invasion from their neighbors to the north, Scotland. And yeah, I know Charles is also the king of Scotland. It's a really, really confusing. There's more of a rebellion in Scotland than it is an invasion. But either way, a Scottish army is crossing into English territory, and he needs money to defend against this invasion, so he has to call Parliament back into session. And so when Parliament's called back into session, they have new elections, and after the new elections, a majority of the members of Parliament are now the Puritans. So the Puritans hold the majority in Parliament, meaning they basically control Parliament. Same way it is in the U.S., whichever political party has the most members in a House of Congress controls that House of Congress. And so the Puritans have the most members in Parliament, thereby they control Parliament. Now, at the same time, you had a minority of members in Parliament who were sort of pro-monarchy, supporters of Charles, and so they sort of formed their own, pro-monarchy royalist group. So what you have in the English Parliament is two very starkly opposite, contrasting political parties on like complete polar opposite ends of the spectrum. The Puritan-controlled Parliament then passed a measure that was intended to limit the king's power and make Parliament the supreme power in England. It was called the 19 Points, and it needs to be said that it was passed like strictly on a party line sort of vote. Barely passed, and realistically it wasn't a very smart political move, but they did it anyway, and this is going to lead to real trouble moving forward in the future here. So of course Charles refuses their demands, and instead decides to lead troops into Parliament to arrest his opposition leaders. And he doesn't just go in there to arrest them because it's like, "Oh, how dare you try to limit my power." There was ample evidence to suggest that these same Puritan leaders who passed this bill to limit his power had also colluded with the Scottish when they invaded England. So, one side of history likes to tell that he wanted to arrest these guys just because they went against him, but in reality, he was within the law to arrest these guys, given that he had ample evidence that they had colluded with the Scottish. Well, as it stood, he goes to Parliament with soldiers to arrest these guys, but they found out about it ahead of time, went into hiding, and so as Charles is questioning the members of Parliament, "Where are these guys? I'm charging them with treason. I need to find them." They all refused to give away the whereabouts of these individuals, and frustrated, his gamble having failed miserably, he is said to have stated, "Well, my birds have all flown the coop," and left. But this was a calculated risk, and it didn't turn out right. And these actions of his means there's no turning back. The conflict between king and Parliament has reached a boiling point, and now England's king and his Parliament are headed towards war. The English Civil War is going to be fought between the supporters of the king, referred to as the Cavaliers, and the supporters of Parliament and the Puritans, known as the Roundheads. Why were the king's people called the Cavaliers? Well, they were generally drawn from the king's cavalry corps, and then other recruits and the supporters of Parliament and the Puritans were called the Roundheads because they all shaved their heads, so, well, their heads looked round. Yes, the human head is round, but that's why they called them the Roundheads. And both sides will be led by, able individuals. The king's forces will be led by Charles himself, and it should be said that while Charles was leading his forces in war, he was also simultaneously trying to negotiate for peace, because even though he is indeed at war with Parliament, it's not necessarily a war that he wants. He's not seeking out this war. Yeah, he made some bad moves, but he doesn't want this civil war. So he's trying to negotiate for peace as he's trying to lead the war effort. And on the other side, the Roundheads choose as their leader the brilliant and strictly religious Puritan Oliver Cromwell. And so it will be the Cavaliers, the Royalists, the supporters of the king versus the Roundheads, the Parliament, and the Puritans. And I'm going to kind of just cut right to the chase here. The English Civil War, it's fought over 4 years, 1642 to 1646, and you can kind of see the progression of the war here in the map. At the start, the king kind of controls a lot of area in the north, and the supporters of Parliament in the south, and you see the ebb and flow of the conflict over the course of the next few years until finally in 1645, a decisive victory for Cromwell's Roundheads at the Battle of Naseby breaks the back of the king's forces. The next year in 1646, they surrender, ending the English Civil War. After a failed escape attempt on the part of the king, Charles also surrenders the following year in 1647. There he goes, waving his white flag. You're English, not French. Anyway, having achieved total victory, the Puritans in Parliament now do, of course, what is the most democratic and Enlightenment-minding thing you can imagine, and that is they remove all their political opponents from Parliament, or they remove anyone who ever disagreed with them. I'm being sarcastic there, of course, and what was left over here was often referred to as the rump Parliament, because a rump roast is after you've cut off all the other good parts of the meat from a side of beef. The rump roast is what's left, and so everything else has been cut off. They called it the rump Parliament. Well, the Rump Parliament then decided to charge King Charles with high treason for, making war against the country, so to speak. He was put on trial, he was tried, he was convicted, and he was sentenced to execution. It should also be said that his trial was not very popular. They couldn't get too many people to actually want to sit as judges on this trial, and the only people who would actually sit as judges were people who wanted to have the king convicted and executed. And when it came to his execution, originally the state executioner refused to carry out the execution because he believed that it was wrong. You shouldn't and couldn't execute the king. And then when he himself was threatened with execution, he agreed to go ahead and carry it out. I suppose his life more important than the life of the other guy. And so, to the shock and horror of many English and those around Europe, on the morning of January 30th, 1649, King Charles I was executed by beheading there in London. And this is not something that had happened in Europe before. And so you can imagine the people in England and others looking on and seeing this transpiring, and it would have just seemed like bizarro world and chaos out of control. But the Parliament, representatives of the people, sort of, voted to execute their former monarch. And so Charles was dead. And with the monarch dead and the monarchy abolished, the Rump Parliament now tried to set up a new government, a republic style of government. But due to constant bickering and political disagreements, we don't know anything about that here in America, of course, they failed to agree upon anything. They failed to produce a new constitution or a new kind of government. Well, eventually, Oliver Cromwell, frustrated with the constant bickering, uses the military, of which he is still in charge, dismisses the Rump Parliament and seizes power for himself. And he goes on to become a military dictator that would rule over England for the next 5 years, enforcing strict Puritan laws on the people of England. And so when we look at this entire story as it's played out, we have to ask ourselves, what did we really accomplish in the end? I mean, are we any better than we were before? Now we have a military dictator, basically a king without a crown, ruling over England. What have we accomplished? It's worth asking the question, and it's also worth asking the question of how well these ideas would apply to the thoughts and the philosophies of the Enlightenment. But that's where we're going to leave it for today. So we saw that the Stuart dynasty picks up after the death of Queen Elizabeth, and really the inception of the Stuart dynasty is the beginning of England's problems. We see that the Stuarts want to be absolute monarchs, but at the same time Parliament wants more power of its own, and it is this conflict that leads to the start of the English Civil War, and we just saw how things really didn't end any differently than they began. And think about, again, how all of this aligns to the ideas of the Enlightenment. Be ready to talk about that the next time that we meet. And as always, until that time, I bid you farewell.